Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, to our men's group, and to our continuing study in the theology of Karl Barth. His Doctrine of Reconciliation, we're looking at volume 4, paragraph 57, pages 20 to 30. These first three lessons are all introductory material, and this time Barth simply wants to teach us that reconciliation is predicated on a proper understanding of the concept of covenant. For Barth, we cannot have a proper understanding of reconciliation unless we first understand the concept of covenant. And he looks at that in a very unique way, a powerful way. So we're going to take a look at 3 moments of covenant within this Doctrine of Reconciliation by Karl Barth. And in Block 1, we begin with a covenant as a concept. Barth says reconciliation is the fulfillment of covenant. The covenant called Israel as a sacral federation of tribes, and fundamentally it was unalterable. It was a lasting covenant. It was a covenant of grace, even though it involved the law. It was a covenant of God's grace, and it was inexhaustible as an occurrence. Very unique. Look at note 4. The one of the communal Israel covenant was an abbreviated concept that enclosed multiple individual narratives. You've got Abraham, you got Noah, Abraham, Moses. You've got multiple individual narratives in multiple ways, but the covenant is always remembered and recalled as a contemporary happening. The varied covenant events are abbreviated under the concept of mutual election. Mutual election. But after Barth tells us this, he says that realistically, if you look at it, the covenant really was more of a diction of an active source, being God, and a passive reception by the tribes of Israel. It really took shape as an authoritative ordinance more than the mutual election. It was more of an authoritative ordinance. From there, we look at how the covenant became incarnate within the nation Israel in Block 2. And it became incarnate as a diatheke, the Greek diatheke. And Barth got this from the Septuagint, so he is using the Greek, but it's still the Old Testament. He's using the Septuagint. But the covenant was considered the incarnate diatheke. It was a declaration of God's will. The Reformation even called it the monopluron, or one-sided covenant. But for Barth, who has already taught us that there has always been, prior to creation itself, the purpose of intention within God himself, he adds in note 3 that the history of creation functions as a cosmic prelude to the history of Israel. There is the covenant of preservation toward creation. There is the covenant of grace toward Israel specifically. But there's also the covenant of future coming, which points beyond Israel to the entire world and toward a universality of salvation. So Barth wants us to understand that this covenant is not a simplistic covenant specifically toward Israel. It is a specific covenant that follows the general covenant of preservation toward creation. And additionally, and important for us who believe in Jesus Christ, is 3, it is a covenant of future coming because it points beyond Israel to the entire world and to a universality of salvation. And that's going to take us on to block 3 and Barth's concluding comments on covenant. Professor Barth in block 3 tells us that we're going to look at the concept of mutual election and the concept of incarnate diatheke both come together in a Trinitarian qualification of covenant. Barth says there is a Trinitarian qualification of the understanding of covenant, and it is to be looked at as an in itself qualification, as a going out of itself qualification, and as a return to God's self qualification of the covenant, of the divine covenant. And first, we have the foundational in itself qualification in 2 axioms. Number 1, creation is the outward basis of the covenant. And number 2, the Judaic covenant is the inward basis of creation. They inform each other. And then 2, the going out of itself qualification of covenant as pertaining to missiology. Israel's covenant is not an end in itself. It holds a representative signification, a representative significance. Israel is to be the mediator of God's covenant to the Gentiles, according to Isaiah, and given to Israel as a covenant to the people. They're to be the representative nation of covenant, and they're to bring that representation to the entire world. Their covenant was a universal covenant, and they were to be the instrumental mediators to carry that covenant to the world. But for us and for those who believe in Jesus Christ, note 3, the eschatological return to God's self-qualification of instrumental universality. The Old Testament covenant has its beginning in the universal primal history, and it has its end in a corresponding eschatological history, a corresponding eschatological divine history. The originary covenant of God with all humanity was there in the beginning, and that covenant of God with all humanity will be there in the end. Jeremiah tells us that God will one day make a new covenant with Israel, and what this means, Barth says, is that the covenant with Israel will be lifted up to its true level of significance. There will be a revealing of its real purpose. There will be a revealing of its real nature. There will be a revealing of its real trajectory and horizon. The only thing that passes away is the form or the economy of the Old Covenant. The form and the economy of the Old Covenant do pass away. And Barth says that this promise of a new covenant will include the following. God will put a new spirit within them. God will take out that stony heart and give them a heart of flesh. God will turn them toward His faithfulness, and He will create the transition from prescriptive letter to liberating spirit, a covenant of liberating spirit. So if you look at note 4, all these qualifications, all 3, point to the atonement covenant, where God will exercise patience and God will remit guilt. God's indwelling spirit will create spiritual perception for His people, who will see the articles of the covenant as self-evident and practice compliance. And then 4b, the unmerited grace. God's unmerited grace will negate the unfaithfulness of Israel, and the covenant will reach atonement through God's faithfulness alone. It will be unmerited grace. The new covenant is the covenant of unmerited grace. I just think that all three introductory lessons have been very powerful by Professor Barth. He gave us a tremendous teaching on God with us, and again expounded we with God, the other side, the response side where we acquire authentic being. And now he says that reconciliation is necessarily founded upon covenant. In fact, reconciliation is the fulfillment of covenant, but it is a diatheke. It is primarily a diatheke. It is a declaration of God's will. It's a declaration of God's truth, is the way we should word it for us under the new covenant of Jesus Christ. It's a declaration of God's truth. It's a declaration of God's aletheia truth in the life, teachings, passion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The New Testament covenant is a declaration of God's aletheia truth. It's a diatheke. But he really did bring out the trifold aspect of the covenant that really did begin with that preservation of creation. Then it got specific as grace for Israel, but then it involved that future promise that, of course, Jürgen Moltmann picked up on. Anytime that Professor Barth spoke of eschatology or promise or the future, Professor Moltmann keyed in on that and definitely adopted Barth into his system as a successor to Barth. And anyone who is familiar with Jürgen Moltmann knows that we're reading very, very similar type articulations of the faith here, very similar to what we've heard in Jürgen Moltmann. So he most certainly was Barth's successor. That's almost universally affirmed. Of course, Karl Barth himself is universally affirmed as God's prophet, and a major prophet, not a minor prophet. Karl Barth was a major prophet for God's kingdom. And Jürgen Moltmann is also universally recognized as a major prophet for God's kingdom. But Moltmann always picked up on this eschatological nature of what Barth taught, and that's why Block 3, Note 3 is going to be key for this succession of Barth and Moltmann. The fact that we have the current corresponding eschatological history of covenant. It's an eschatological covenant history that we participate in, and it is a covenant with all of humanity. And it's the lifting of the old covenant. It is the henosis lifting unto God's self of the old covenant. The old covenant was a covenant of grace, says Barth. Yes, it was a covenant of the law, but it was a covenant of grace foundationally. It was God's grace that reached out to his people. It was a covenant of grace, and it has been lifted up into the henosis unification with God's self, as it has been lifted into new covenant through the declaration of God's aletheia truth in the person and ministry of Jesus Christ, and in his passion and resurrection, or what many dialectical theologians call a Christ event. But we basically get a look here at a very, very third foundational introductory work by Professor Barth. These first three lessons have only been 10 pages each. We're going to take this in very small portions so we don't miss any of the treasure of Barth's content. And all of his content is a spiritual treasure. We don't want to miss it. We're going to continue in very small portions, but we have gone through the concept of God with us. We've gone through the concept of we with God, and now we have looked at the trifold or Trinitarian qualification of the concept of covenant, and how it has been lifted up into a unification with God as a higher and new covenant of an eschatological covenant with all of humanity. With all of humanity. A universality, which is a universal invitation to all of creation to participate in God's grace, in God's covenant. So that's going to give us our third lesson, and I am not going to burden anybody with any large readings. We're going to stay at about 10 pages per lesson, so I think that's fair to everyone because we don't want to miss the depth of content, the real treasure in Professor Barth's teaching. There's so much truth and so much goodness, we don't want to read over it. So we'll pick up 30 to 40 next time.